Latin from scratch, 28th class, the syntax of ut. This is kind of like the other side of the same coin. Let's say we, in the previous class, studied the syntax of cum. Now let's go with the syntax of ut. And here you will see that it is somehow kind of similar. Okay, so we are going to study first a summary of the syntax of ut. We will have another amazing table, and then ut as time conjunction, ut as a completive conjunction, ut as final conjunction, etc., etc. Okay, and then the syntax of ne. We will see that ne is kind of just like the reverse of ut. We will understand it as soon as I explain. Okay, so first, summary of the syntax of ut. The word ut has many different functions in Latin, some of them quite frequent, which is why we need to learn how to identify the specific value in a given text. So again, amazing table. And here we see that this table is kind of simpler. And then here we see, like we have two functions in the indicative mood and 4 functions in the subjunctive mood. Okay, so first, indicative. We have temporal. So again, we would translate it as when, just when. So, ut hostes nostros viderunt, fugerunt. When the enemies saw our men, they fled. Then it can also, just like with cum, it can be emphasized with ut primum, simul ut, statim ut, which is as soon as, whatever. Quite easy, there's nothing really to explain there. Then comparison manner. In the superordinate clause, another way to say the main clause, there usually is the correlative adverb sic or ita. So for example, ita feci ut voluisti. I did it as you wanted. Literally, it would be like, I did whatever, like that, like you wanted. Okay, so but in English it's kind of redundant. So again, this value, this function is quite easy to understand. There's no really nothing there, and then it's really not so common. Okay, now let's go into the subjunctive functions. We have the completive. What is a completive? Completive, or I really don't know where the accent goes in English, but I guess you understand, So completive, functioning, working as the subject or direct object of the superordinate verb. If the superordinate verb has meaning of fear, the translation is negative. Okay, so, and I know that this is super specific and it might seem even kind of random, but it is important, okay? This about the fear. Okay, so at first, most sentences don't have anything to do with fear, okay? So let's go first with the generic, the most frequent use, meaning. So for example, we say, optamus ut tu bene sis. We wish that you are well. So this is a completive clause because it completes the sentence, the main verb. So, optamus, we wish. What do you wish? That you are well. Ut tu bene sis. So, in this case, this what do you wish? Like, we wish this. So that's the direct object of the main clause. Okay? Then, for example, timeo ut veniat. So now timeo is obviously a verb which is related to fear. No, we translate it as I fear. So in this case, notice that we have to translate ut as that not. In English it will depend if that he doesn't, that he will not, whatever. No, but like in a negative way. Okay, this is important because, of course, it means the opposite. Okay, so it is very important to keep this in mind. Because imagine that we don't know this rule, that when the verb of fear, then we have to translate it in the other way. Then we would translate, I fear that he will come. No, it means the opposite. I fear that he will not come. Okay? So usually just that. Of course, you know that in English, we could just say, we wish you are well. In Latin, you need this ut, which you can also put here in English. And then timio ut veniat, because this is fear, then I fear that he will not come. Okay. Then consecutive. In the superordinate clause, there usually is some word which anticipates the consequence, such as sic ita, like this, adeo, to such an extent, tam, so, tantus, so big, etc. Okay? So, do notice, because these consecutive at first, at first they are kind of hard to see and to identify, to spot. So, but, I mean, you just have to somehow feel the rhythm, feel the music of the sentence, okay? So, let's see. Adeo oppidum oppugnabatur ut incolae iam captos viderentur. So, the city was assaulted adeo. Literally is ad eo. So, to such an extent, so this adeo is to such an extent that, because, so notice consecutive. What does consecutive mean? Like it's about a consequence, okay? So this, imagine that you start saying the city was assaulted to such an extent. So you say to such an extent that what? No, so this, I mean, the body is asking you to finish the sentence, no? So you need the consequence of to such an extent. Okay, so that's what I meant by you have to feel the rhythm, okay? So the city was assaulted to such an extent that ut. And of course, notice that you translate that all in the same way, but this is completive, like direct object, and here is a consecutive, okay? That the inhabitants already saw themselves captured. Then final, visible only from the context. So final is like the goal, okay? So dux exercitum ad muros duxit ut milites hostes repellerent. The general led the army to the walls so that the soldiers could, or in order for the soldiers to, repel the enemy. Of course, there are several ways to translate the same thing as long as they indicate that this is the goal of the main clause. Okay, so why does the general lead the army to the walls? So that, no, in order to, etc. And then do notice, dux ad muros venit ut hostes repellere. And you might see, like, it's almost the same sentence, but there is a difference. The general came to the walls in order to, just like to, repel the enemies. What is the difference? We are going to explain it a bit later, okay? Just as soon as we finish with the table, etc. And then the last function is concessive, which is rare. In the superordinate clause, there usually is some particle such as tamen, atamen, elominus. You already know this, okay? So, ut desin vires tamen voluntas extit. Even though strength might be missing, however, there is still will. Okay, so there, that's deep. Now, let's go a bit deeper. Ut as time conjunction. It can be the connector introducing an adverbial subordinate clause of time only when the subordinate verb is in the indicative mood. Ut hostes notre viderum fugerum. When the enemies saw our men, they fled. Also with the subordinate verb, in the indicative, can we have phrases such as ut primum simul ut or statim ut, which add immediacy? We can translate them as soon as. Okay, that's quite easy. Then ut as a completive conjunction. The word ut can also introduce a completive subordinate clause or complement clause. You might be more familiar with this complement clause because this clause, this subordinate clause, is a complement of the main clause, of the superordinate clause, okay? It can be the direct object or the subject, which may have the obligatory function of the subject or the direct object of the superordinate clause. This only happens when the subordinate verb is in the subjunctive mode. Most of the times we can translate it as that within parentheses because in English, as I already said, you can just omit, no? We wish that you are well or we wish you are well. However, when the superordinate verb is related with fear or the superordinate clause conveys that general idea, what I mean by this is that usually the verb itself means something about fear. But even if the verb itself is not about fear, but in the general sentence, the feeling is of fear, then the rule applies also, okay? Then ut is translated in a negative way, which in English, here in this case, we see, I fear that he will not come, okay? Then ut as a final conjunction. Also, when the subordinate verb is in the subjunctive mood, we can have an adverbial subordinate clause of go, or final, whatever. Depending on whether the subject of the superordinate and the subordinate clauses is the same or different, we need to translate in different ways. Okay, so that's why I had kind of like the same sentences twice, because there is a difference, and we will see. Okay, I have everything there. So, same subject, different subject. So again, depending on whether the subject of the superordinate and the subordinate clause is the same or different. So if we have two clauses, then we can have, we have two verbs, and each of those verbs can have one subject. So it can be, this subject can be different for each of the two verbs, or it can be the same subject. And depending on that, there will be some differences. Okay, so let's go. There, same subject. Dux ad muros venit ut hostes repelleret. So the general came to the walls in order to repel the enemies. So who came? The general. Who repels? The general. So the general is the subject of both verbs. So in this case, we just translate as in order to, or just to repel the enemies. But then, when the subject is different, then let's see first. No, dux exercitum ad muros duxit ut milites hostes repellerit. So the general led the army to the walls so that the soldiers could, or in order for the soldiers to repel the enemies. So who leads the army to the walls? The general. But then who repels? The soldiers. So now we have two verbs, and each of these two verbs has a different subject. So in this case, we have to play a bit more in English with the translation, no? So when it was the same subject, it was just in order to, or just to. But here is so that the soldiers could, or in order for the soldiers to, you are a native, so you should know better than me. So that's it. Okay, just take that into account. Then, now this is an important question, because the two most common functions when ut has a subjunctive verb, then the question is ut completive or final? Okay, because these are the two most common functions, both of them are in the subjunctive. So how do we know when it is that or in order to, etc.? Okay. So there is no scientific way, let's say, to tell if ut plus subjunctive is completive or final. However, most of the times it can be figured out in a quite simple way. So let's see. First, we should first check if the subordinate clause is completive. So remember, subject or direct object. If this, because remember that a completive subordinate clause is a clause which is necessary for the main clause to be complete. That's why it is completive. So if the superordinate, the main clause, lacks its subject or direct object, then the ut clause is completed. But if the superordinate clause already has all its necessary complements and has full sense, then it doesn't require another subject or another direct object. So in that case, then the ut clause is final. Okay? Of course, we will see this when we practice with translations, but I think this is quite, I explained it decently enough, okay? And then, the syntax of ne. We said that in the same, I really don't know if you say this in English, no, but in Spanish we have this kind of idiom, like the two faces of the same coin, no? So now, like we have ut and ne, and they are kind of the same, but the opposite, okay? So The word ne is pretty much the opposite of ut, only when the subordinate verb is in the subjunctive mood. So ne only works in this, okay, in this form. So the word ne is pretty much the opposite of ut, only in the subjunctive. According to this, we will translate it in a negative way most of the times, unless there is an idea of fear in the superordinate clause, in which case the translation is positive. Okay? So let's give some examples. For example, here, if I say optamus ut tu benesis, we wish that you are well. Imagine that we say optamus ne tu benesis, then we wish that you are not well. Or if we say timeo ne veniat, I fear that he will come. Okay? So, I mean, it's just that. Just that. Ne is the opposite of ut. And that's it. Okay, so of course, I know that this is kind of a dense class, this and also the previous class with Kun. Both of them are quite dense, like a lot of information, a lot of grammar, maybe like many of these terms like consecutive, final, concessive, etc. that you might not know from before. Well, that's why we are here. Okay, so nothing, let's go and practice.